we'll go first to the screen and to Wendy. And Wendy Cutler, I mentioned we had some news, or at least reports about what may be the news that's coming on the U.S.-China front, that a deal may be near, and that in a few weeks Xi Jinping will make a return visit to Mar-a-Lago in Florida, perhaps to seal a deal. So, Wendy, if you can give us your thoughts on what the latest is, where things stand, and what we ought to most be watching for as these details emerge. Over to you, Wendy.
Okay, well, thank you, and good morning to all my friends in New York. I know that New Yorkers always tease people in Washington about how we overreact to snow, and when there's any prediction of snow, we close our schools right away. So it seems like you all did the same thing this morning, and maybe the snow expectations weren't met. With respect to the U.S.-China trade dispute, all reports suggest last week, and then as reported this morning in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, that we're headed in a really positive direction. And the likely outcome is there will be a U.S.-China trade deal concluded. And the Wall Street Journal indicated that the two sides are looking to schedule a summit between the two leaders, President Xi Jinping and President Trump, in Mar-a-Lago around March 27th, the end of the month. This is good news, and it seems like a lot of progress and a lot of preparatory work has been made on this deal, on these negotiations, which could really pave the way for a successful summit meeting. When I think of this deal, I think of four different baskets, and I think this is a good way to think, to really get your arms around which issues still need work and which issues seem to be largely resolved. The four buckets of issues being negotiated include, number one, what I call kind of the shopping list, and that means really Chinese announcements of further purchases they'll be making of U.S. goods and services. The second bucket involves market access commitments, and that really includes the reduction of tariff and other trade barriers and investment restrictions to allow more U.S. exports and U.S. investment in China. The third involves structural issues, and this is the basket that includes everything from forced technology transfer to IPR to state-owned enterprises to industrial subsidies. And fourth, the bucket of enforcement, and that means ensuring that whatever's agreed upon, provisions are included in this deal to ensure that China lives up to its obligations. And it's no surprise that the third and fourth buckets of issues regarding structural issues and enforcement issues are proving the most difficult, and while progress has been made, they still need to make more progress in order to seal this deal. With respect to the structural issues, the reason why they're so important is that these are the issues that are going to, if handled correctly and negotiated in a meaningful way, could really help over the longer term reduce the friction between the United States and China on the trade front. By China just agreeing to buy more, while that's a welcome announcement, it does nothing to solve really the underlying fundamental differences between the two sides. And why enforcement is so important is that it's very easy to negotiate a deal when a country just announces they're going to do this, they're going to do that. But if there's no serious monitoring and enforcement mechanism, a lot of the times the country's really let off the hook. And with respect to China, I do think that there is validity here. The previous administrations were too focused on negotiating commitments and were not focused enough on the follow-through. So I hope that this administration is really serious about the follow-through and produces a very meaningful enforcement mechanism. So in short, where we are, we're close to a deal. We're headed in that direction. A few more weeks left. I suspect Ambassador Lighthizer and his team will get together with his counterparts in China in the lead up to the Mar-a-Lago summit. And I expect, barring any unforeseen developments, and you could never rule that out with this president, that we will have a deal announced between the United States and China.
Wendy, thank you very much. That's a lot you've put on the table, and I have some questions. I'm sure others do too, but let's bring Arthur into the conversation. And Wendy started with these 4 buckets issue-wise. You said something interesting to us earlier about 4 constituencies in terms of on the U.S. side, although I've introduced you as an expert on the Chinese perspective. I don't know if you want to start with those 4 different kinds of buckets here, or whatever else you want to jump
Right.
in.
So I'll just make a few quick points. And the first, since we are in a quadripartite mode of analysis here, I will start with a framework that I've been using for most of the last year to try and explain to my usually quite baffled clientele of financial services firms and multinationals to try and make sense of what's going on the U.S. side. And it seems to me that there are, broadly speaking, 4 constituencies or forces at work trying to shape U.S. policy towards China in this era that is more focused on strategic competition or rivalry than has been the case in the past. And just quickly, these would be, number one, the national security establishment, which is quite concerned about China's potential to rival the U.S. geopolitically and militarily, and they are quite concerned in connection with this about China's efforts to rapidly upgrade its technological basis, particularly in things like semiconductors and artificial intelligence, which clearly have military applications. So there's a strong view from the security side that it should be an aim of U.S. policy to constrain China's technological progress to the extent possible and to ensure that the U.S. maintains a big technological lead over China. So that's a fairly hardline view. Related to this is the hardline trade view, I think, represented by USTR Lighthizer, which essentially has taken the perspective that the Chinese development model is very problematic. It's created huge problems for the U.S. industrial base because of so-called forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, the subsidies for state-owned enterprises, et cetera, et cetera. And so there needs to be very, very forceful U.S. action to change the way that China organizes its economy, the way that it does business, in a way to make it more consistent with the traditional rules of the game as created by the United States and its allies. So again, this is a pretty hardline view that's focused on long-term structural change in the Chinese economy. Then there's a third group, which is essentially the business community, and this would have its advocate in the administration in Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, which is fundamentally concerned with market access for U.S. firms. And so this is connected to the structural agenda. The reason that U.S. firms don't have as much market access as they would like is there are joint venture requirements or other onerous regulatory things that make the cost of market entry quite a lot higher than many companies would like, and in some cases make it simply impossible to enter the market. So they share some of the structural concerns, but the motive here is to maximize the ability of U.S. companies to operate in China profitably, whereas the motivation of the trade and the security hardliners, to some degree, is to encourage U.S. companies actually to not invest so much in China. There is a bit of a decoupling agenda, both on the security side and the trade hardliner side. And the logic there is that having a high degree of investment or engagement in China may be good for the multinational companies, but it isn't necessarily good for U.S. workers or the U.S. economy, right? So I think there is some daylight between the business community, which wants more market access, and both the trade and the security hardliners who are somewhat ambivalent about whether this level of economic engagement is really such a great idea. And then the fourth element, obviously, is President Trump, who I don't think is really ideologically committed to any of these positions, and is much more concerned about his own sort of political advantage. And I think has clearly demonstrated over the course of the last 2 years that he is willing to shift his support from one or the other of these factions to another almost at the drop of a hat. So he's a real unpredictability factor. So I think what's been going on over the last couple of months is that Trump, for political reasons, has essentially decided that it's essential for him to make a trade deal with China. He needs it now. He's got a lot of political problems at home. He needs a win. He needs to be able to show that the pressure that he put on China delivered some concrete results. So over the last couple of months, I think we've seen a real solidification of his position, which is we need a deal, we need it now, and I'm not going to wait for us to solve all of the structural issues that we have with China. So we'll take what we can get right now, and then maybe some of these more difficult things will have to be dealt with down the road. And this is causing, I think, a lot of heartburn for the hardliners who would like to see the administration take a much tougher stance. So that, I think, is my perception of the background on the U.S. side. Let me just make two other quick points. One is, from a financial markets perspective, I think it's been clear that the specter of full-on trade war between the world's two biggest economies and two biggest trading countries, it was a big part of the reason that we saw last year was such a terrible year for financial markets. Basically, there were no assets that posted a positive return last year other than if you had cash in the bank. And the stock market, particularly in the last quarter of last year in the U.S., did terribly. And I think that market performance is one reason why Trump has decided that he really needs to make a deal. So I think where we're at, presuming this deal goes through, is this kind of macroeconomic risk from a trade war is now pretty much off the table. But there's still some technology sector risk because the hardliners on the U.S. side, if they don't have the trade instruments anymore to try and pressure China, they will probably make more use of things like export controls and investment restrictions to try and contain China's technology ambitions. And those could have quite wide-ranging effects. So there is a tech risk, I think, still out there. And then finally, just quickly on how this looks like from the Chinese perspective, I think here the focus has been on why Trump needs to make a deal. But Xi Jinping, I think, faces an equally strong set of political incentives to make a deal. The Chinese economy is growing through a trough. Right now, it's very weak. It's weak not just because of trade, or not even primarily because of trade, but because of domestic problems. Our analysis is that the first half of the year is going to be really tough. Second half of the year might be a little bit better because they're allowing credit to flow more freely now. And so from Xi's standpoint, getting a deal now is really great because it gives him some breathing room to solve the domestic economic problems in China without having to worry about another load of tariffs. And then once we get to the end of the year with the Chinese economy in a more stable position, I think he'll see himself as being in a stronger negotiating position with the U.S. So there's a strong set of incentives for Xi as well as Trump to make a deal now, to give up some stuff in order to make that deal happen because it buys time for China to strengthen its position for later.
Thank you, Arthur. Let me come back to Wendy for a second and to your four buckets, if I have them right, that you and particularly the fourth issue of enforcement. And if you can help us from your unique vantage point of somebody who's been in so many rooms when these things are being hashed out, and to your point, in buckets 1 and 2, shopping list and market access from everything we're reading, that's where the progress seems to be. But if you're in that room, what are some enforcement mechanisms or some details, without going too deeply into the weeds there, that you would be insisting upon or advocating for? And as consumers of this kind of information, what should we be looking for that would look like either good news on the enforcement front or not so much?
Yeah. Before I get to that, just a couple of comments on what Arthur said, and I really value his insightful comments. Number one, I would just add when it comes to President Trump and his views, I don't think we can discount his focus on bilateral trade deficits. He focuses on them with every country, and China's, bilateral trade deficit is by far the largest. And that's why I think China has been focusing on the first bucket, which is showing Trump that they're willing to buy more U.S. soybeans, buy more U.S. LNG, all in an effort to show him that the bilateral trade deficit can come down. And so I don't think we can discount that, but I think if the Chinese are putting too much emphasis on that basket, they may lose sight of the importance of the structural and the enforcement issues. I would also say Arthur said something really important, and that is, and this is based on my experience as a trade negotiator, it's easiest to make a trade deal when both sides are in the room and for their own reasons, they want to reach a deal and they want to reach a deal now. And I think Arthur has really underscored that the interest of both sides to make a deal are strong right now for different reasons. But I think that also increases the likelihood that a deal will shortly be reached. Now, with respect to your question, Tom, on enforcement, there are a lot of different issues that are involved in the enforcement issue. And once again, the crux of this issue is that basically you want to ensure that your trading partner is going to live up to the obligations that they've made, and also that these obligations are going to result in some important change in the marketplace. So you're not just asking China to change all its laws on IPR or technology transfer for the hell of it. What you're hoping is that you'll also see an outcome in the marketplace which demonstrates that these changes in practices are really leading to a level playing field. So there's a lot of issues that are under negotiation with enforcement, and I kind of would isolate them into three different categories. One is the process. Second are the benchmarks. And third, what are the penalties if you're found in violation? So with respect to the process, Ambassador Lighthizer told the Ways and Means Committee last year that he's already agreed with China on an elaborate set of meetings, which will take place at all levels of the government to look at enforcement. And I think the meetings are important. They're an important first step, but in isolation, they're clearly not enough. What concerns me on these meetings is that there seems to be a focus that at these meetings, the U.S. would bring forward complaints by U.S. business. And I think that if there's too much reliance on complaints from U.S. business, that this process and these meetings may not be productive. And that is because U.S. companies are concerned about retribution from China if they're too public on complaining. And so I think it's key that when the administration sets up any enforcement mechanism, that is really asking the whole of government to be monitoring Chinese enforcement and really using our embassy and our consulates all around China to make sure that China's living up to its obligations. Second, with respect to the benchmarks, the importance here, once again, is, are you just asking China to enact a law, or are you asking them to show results in the marketplace? And I'm sure here, China is more interested in the former, while the U.S. is probably focused on the latter, wanting to somehow measure outcomes in the marketplace which demonstrate that the agreement is working. And then with respect to the third area, penalties, here there are kind of two sub-issues. One is, who decides if China is in violation of this agreement? Do you leave it to a group of panelists like the WTO does? I doubt it. Do you want some kind of joint assessment by U.S. and China? I suspect China is pushing for that. Or if you're the U.S., do you want to preserve your right to unilaterally decide whether China's living up to its obligations or not? And I suspect this is one of the trickiest issues that needs to be resolved. With respect to penalties, I think the core issue under negotiation is, what do you do with the existing tariffs in place? Let's keep in mind now, the U.S. has tariffs in place on about $250 billion worth of Chinese imports. I'm sure China now is urging the United States to lift all of those tariffs and get rid of them. I suspect the United States wants to at least leave some of them in and raise and lift them over time as China demonstrates that it's living up to its obligations. And so I think these are probably the core issues that are under negotiation now, and they're going to be, they're going to be difficult to resolve. But I do think that a mutually satisfactory outcome could be reached if both sides are determined to do so.
So, Arthur, are we, if I understand both of you correctly, are we potentially in a place here where a deal is reached that doesn't satisfy, certainly not, maybe not even Ambassador Lighthizer, but not Steve Bannon and that whole wing, but that after that deal, there is the cudgel, or whatever you want to call it, of existing tariffs, potentially even new tariffs, that is used to adjudicate, or as Wendy said, just as kind of an enforcement mechanism of its own? Is that what you think is coming?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been discussed publicly is the possibility of a so-called snapback provision, which I think Wendy can explain in more detail what that means. But fundamentally, the idea is that the U.S. would reserve the right to reimpose tariffs that had been relaxed if certain benchmarks were not reached. And then, as Wendy pointed out, that the issue there is, like, how do you decide whether those benchmarks have not, what are those benchmarks, and how do you decide whether they have been reached or not? Yeah, I mean, I guess the sort of additional point I would make is, yeah, I think you're already starting to see people from the more hardline side of the U.S. establishment start to criticize this deal. And so I think there's going to be more pressure on that. So, there is some risk that we get to the end of the month and Trump is feeling so much heat from the right flank, who were claiming that this is a surrender and it's terrible.
And some Democrats too,
right?
maybe.
And some Democrats as well. This is not a deal that requires, a congressional approval. The president basically can just do it. But there's some risk that you get to the end of the month and he might feel, I'm going to look weak if I sign this, so I have to walk away from that. I would put that at sort of like a 10% or less tail risk. I think he's politically better off signing the deal. But I think what we have to focus on is that if we do get this deal, which is going to be complicated and it's not going to deliver everything by any means that the sort of tougher people on the U.S. side would want, then I think we have to start looking at how things like export controls and investment restrictions start to be deployed, because as far as I can tell, those lie outside the scope of this agreement. The U.S. last year, with bipartisan support, strengthened both its export control law and its foreign investment screening law, basically for the purpose of making life tougher for China. We've seen, partly as a result of this, a huge reduction in the amount of Chinese direct investment in the United States. We've seen the Department of Commerce start to indicate the kinds of technologies that would be restrained under these laws. So one of the questions I have is that once we get past this trade agreement, how much of the energy of the hardline people on the U.S. side gets focused on using these export controls and investment restrictions as the tool, given that the tariff tool probably has been largely defanged? So
it's almost halfway through the hour, and that's when we like to come to the room. I'm just seeing that we already have a number of questions in the moderator inbox about an issue that we haven't raised yet, and so I'll do that in maybe summarizing a few of these, which is, you mentioned tech briefly, but it's really it's the Huawei issue, but in two parts, and I invite both of you maybe to tackle either one or both of these issues. Part one is the specific matter of the case of the chief financial officer of the corporation, who, of course, was detained in Canada, and whether that, obviously it's a legal matter for the United States and other governments, and as a legal matter, normally you don't lump that into trade negotiations, but there have been certain hints and suggestions from the White House that perhaps it will be. So where's that? And then more broadly, although you briefly mentioned tech, I assume that all these issues of security and 5G and all that stuff are I mean, I don't see any hint that that's really being covered in any kind of way in these early reports. So, Wendy, why don't we come to you first for either or both of the Huawei matters?
Yeah. So, with respect to the Huawei issue, I have no doubt that when President Xi meets with President Trump, that he may appeal to President Trump as something that he needs in order to be able to sell this trade deal at home. And given that about 6 months ago, when the leaders were in contact and she appealed to Trump to soften our sanctions on ZTE, another Chinese telecom company, I think that, the Chinese may perceive that Trump may move on this issue. I think it's going to be a lot trickier for President Trump this time, number one, because of the outcry on the administration kind of walking back on the ZTE restrictions. I think there will be a lot of congressional outcry if indeed the president somehow trades off Huawei for the trade deal. But I do think that this issue may come up at the summit meeting. Because remember, China's going to need something out of this deal. Arthur mentioned export controls and investment restrictions. Almost in every negotiation I was with in China, those were two of the issues they always asked us to move on and to be softer on, export controls and investment restrictions. And I think it's clear that if she were to ask the president to move on either of those issues, his hands are tied. There are laws in place and he won't be able to move. So the Huawei issue may seem like a logical issue, but I think the congressional outcry would be very strong. There is an important reason why legal enforcement issues are always on a separate track from trade negotiations. And I would hope that the administration would continue keeping these issues separate. I also would just say, wouldn't there be an irony that the administration's talking about the importance of enforcement of any U.S.-China trade deal, and in the same breath maybe moving or considering moving on a Huawei enforcement issue. And so I think the issue it's not off the table, but I think the administration and the president would face a lot of pushback if they were to show any flexibility on this issue at this point.
Not a lot to add. I thought that was really covered the issues brilliantly. No question, China would want something on this. And I think Wendy alluded to the point of what does Xi Jinping need to sell this deal back home? It's more of a closed political process, but there is a political dynamic there as well. And this cannot be a deal which is presented simply as a list of U.S. wins and Chinese capitulations. That is just not something that Xi can plausibly sell to his colleagues back home. So I think basically, although he may argue for some relaxation of the Huawei situation, I think more likely what China will be able to walk away from is some kind of schedule of reductions in tariffs. So she will be able to go back and say, look, we were facing all these tariffs, and now they're not necessarily all coming down at once, but we have a clear pathway to reducing tariffs. We've basically taken the trade issue off the table. And then I think if there's, maybe some kind of, I agree it would be incredibly risky at this point for the administration to try and meddle with the Meng Wanzhou case. But if they can come to some kind of perhaps tacit or unpublished agreement on just what the type of sanctions or controls on Huawei would be, which could take the form of, while there's some kind of an agreement, Huawei pays some kind of money in settlement of claims over sanctions or intellectual property theft, but it's contained. then that might be a way of enabling both sides to walk away with something from that. But I tend to think that the Huawei thing is likely to go on for quite a while because, again, on the security side in the U.S., there's a large number of people who are convinced that Huawei is just a major threat to U.S. national security, and so they're going to be quite resistant to any kind of compromise on that.
All right, let's come to the room, and if you don't mind saying who you are and whether you have a preference as to whether you'd like Wendy Cutler or Arthur Kroeber to take your question. We'll start over here, and if you can push the button there so everybody can hear you, great.
Ken Wasserman, I'm an attorney for either panel member. To what extent is there any requirements of the United States being discussed apart from tariff reduction and maybe Huawei issues? Is there anything else that China is asking for the United States to affirmatively do in these talks?
Other things that would be a win for China?
Those are the obvious ones. Are you aware of anything else, Wendy?
Wendy, do you hear us?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Arthur. I mean, through the years when I've negotiated with China, they've always had a long list of issues. Once again, export controls, investment restrictions, and telecom restrictions on the top of the list. But I do think the tariffs, the fate of the existing tariffs will be key. I also think that it will be important for China to say that it has agreed to provisions in the agreement, particularly with respect to structural issues, for its own domestic reasons. And here, with the National People's Congress meeting now and other important economic meetings taking place in China over the next 2 weeks, we may see China announcing certain things that it plans to do for its own reasons, full well knowing that some of these issues will be addressed in the trade agreement. So in other words, they'll need to show that they are undertaking these reforms for their own reasons, not in response to U.S. pressure.
Yeah, just one quick addition to that. I mean, I think the main Chinese negotiating objective here is to make this specter of tariffs go away. They basically just need to not have that level of macroeconomic risk right now, and then they're willing to make all kinds of deals on structural issues that they can hopefully manage over time. But I don't think they have an ask much more at the moment than, number one, making the tariffs go away, or freezing them or reducing them, and number two, maybe getting some progress on the Huawei issue.
Yep, Monica.
Thank you. I was just wondering, you spoke about reducing tariffs after the deal. Given the strong sentiments in the steel industry against imports of steel from China, do you think that President Trump would reduce the 25% tariffs on Chinese steel imports?
Wendy, you want to try that one first?
Yeah. First, you're correct. When we're talking about sanctions, tariffs against China, they're basically ones that have been imposed under Section 301 of the trade law, and not the ones on steel and aluminum that have also been applied against China. My understanding is those steel and aluminum tariffs against China are not in the cards, are not under negotiation. And frankly, there's so many other tariffs imposed on imports of Chinese steel and aluminum under our countervailing duty anti-dumping laws that the impact of these 232 sanctions against Chinese steel and aluminum imports have been pretty negligible. So in short, I don't see any resolution on those steel and aluminum imports unless China was willing to agree to a very restrictive quota in those two areas. And as far as I know, that issue is just not on the table right now. There's so many other issues being negotiated, and this isn't a priority for China or for the United States.
Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Dong from a Chinese Council in New York, and just author mentioned, and media and expert, and both country negotiators are now positive on making a deal. We're heading to a deal. And also author mentioned that the last step also some risk. And we know that the last step is always important, but sometimes risky, dangerous. So we still have 3 weeks to the end. Probably the possible Mar-a-Lago, another summit in Mar-a-Lago. So I wonder the next stage, if hardliner you mentioned, or Congress, like Democrats, like Senator Schumer, always concerned on Chinese currency rate. If hardliner and the Congress would stop or make some difficulties on the negotiation, what would they do? Could you give me any prediction or comments?
I think all they can do is raise a stink. There is no legislative mechanism that I'm aware of. Maybe Wendy is, but there's no legislative mechanism that I'm aware of that would enable Congress to stop the deal. So what they can do is they can ratchet up the heat and create a lot of noise and make it politically costly for the president to do the deal. My judgment on this is that there are enough things on the other side of the ledger that the president will see it in his political interest to do a deal. If he can get a deal which helps soybean farmers, that's huge because that's part of his base, right? There also talk about a major Chinese LNG purchase. So again, energy industry would benefit. So there are some very tangible benefits which are quite specifically related to core parts of Trump's constituency from this deal. Furthermore, I think we have a lot of evidence that when you get closer to a deal, the stock market goes up. And when it looks like the deal is going to break down, the stock market goes down. And we have a lot of evidence that Trump is quite sensitive to those movements. So I think if you stack all of those things up, a deal offering specific goodies for his constituencies and the deal almost certainly going to be ratified by the stock market in a big way, he'll look at people in Congress or even, in the Defense Department or whatever saying, oh, no, this is terrible. You need to be tougher. He'll say, I really don't care about that stuff because that doesn't hurt me in any way. So that's why we can't predict Trump with 100% certainty, as we now know, but I think the deck is pretty much stacked in favor of the deal happening.
Can I ask one question as a follow-up to the gentleman from the Chinese consulate? For you, I guess, Arthur, since you just made that point, which is Congress, as you say, members of Congress and others, interested parties can make a stink and not much else. But we have seen on other occasions and different issues times when a stink is made. I mean, for example, I could imagine, I'd be surprised actually if it doesn't happen, that in the next few days or weeks there will be editorials written, arguments made that go back to what President Trump, in his hardest line, talk about China, had said as a candidate and even as president, and pointing out that this apparent deal doesn't come close to addressing the things and is there a possibility, and I'm not asking you to be a clairvoyant here, but that the president would hear that stink or hear all these issues raised and start to get cold feet or alter his views?
Yeah, but I think it's very, very low, partly for the reasons that I suggested, partly because I think actually if you look at his statements as opposed to the statements of people around him like Steve Bannon and
Right.
Peter Navarro, Trump himself was always much more circumspect in his personal claims about China, right? And he let other people make the most aggressive and outlandish statements. So I think, he's a pretty successful political operator. So I think he's created enough space for himself that he can plausibly present whatever he comes up with at the end of the month as a win and a validation of his tariff techniques. We put the tariffs on for the purpose of getting certain things, and look, here we got those things. And the other thing is the trade deficit with China has actually been expanding. So to the extent that he cares about that, he does need some Chinese buying to pull that back down again.
Got it. We have an interesting question, good one for you actually, Wendy, on that's come into the inbox from beyond the room. After the United States and China reach a deal, so assuming they do you think it's possible for the United States to launch other negotiations with countries in Asia? In other words, what's the possible knock-on impact for the American trade posture in other parts of Asia if this goes through?
Yes, I mean, the U.S. is now poised to start negotiations with Japan and the European Union. The U.S. administration has gone through all the congressional procedures necessary to launch those talks, but clearly Ambassador Lighthizer has been very busy with China. So during his hearing last week, Ambassador Lighthizer indicated that probably come the end of this month, early April, he will launch negotiations with Japan, and there he will be pressing for increased access to Japan's agriculture market, given that Japan has already given access to the other TPP countries and to the EU, and will also press for more access and more import restrictions with respect to the automotive market, among other issues. With the European Union, it's a little more complicated. We're ready to launch negotiations with the European Union, but the EU is now going through their own internal procedures with their parliament, with their member states, to come up with a mandate. So I suspect, once again, you'll see the initiation of talks between the U.S. and Japan take off pretty quickly in probably early April, and then we'll have to see what happens with the European Union if indeed the EU mandate is robust enough to coincide with U.S. objectives for a trade negotiation. That negotiation, I think, with the EU is going to be trickier.
Want to add to that at all, or no?
No.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell me what will most likely happen in using your buckets, Wayne, in bucket number 3 and bucket number 4? Will there be anything meaningful coming out of that? And if so, what will be the nature of it?
You catch that, Wendy? Your buckets 3
Yeah,
and 4.
so my bucket number 3, structural issues. So let's just start with intellectual property protection and enforcement. I think here you're going to see the most robust outcomes of all of the structural issues. And one of the reasons for that is because China's at that point where, for its own domestic reasons, it needs a strong IPR regime. So its interests are beginning to coincide more with the United States. And as a result, I think you're going to see additional enforcement measures. I think you'll see movements on their patent law, on their trade secrets law. With respect to forced technology transfer, my understanding is that's where the progress to date has been the slowest. I'm sure the U.S. is insisting on the end to this practice. It's easy to say that at a very high level, but how you memorialize those commitments on paper is very tricky, with China basically saying, we don't force companies to do this, they're doing it on their own will. So that issue in particular is going to be difficult. I suspect at a minimum, both sides will agree that as a condition for investment or a condition for entering into a joint venture with a Chinese company, no technology will be required to be shared with the Chinese partner. But I don't think that will go far enough for the administration. When you get to industrial subsidies, that's also a very tough issue because all governments subsidize to some degree. But the problem is that Chinese subsidies are massive and they're also create trade distortions and excess capacity. I think here at a minimum, you'll see agreement to increase transparency on subsidies. So at least we know which subsidies are out there. I think you'll probably see Chinese agreement to allow U.S. companies in China, at least on paper, to participate in these subsidies programs. But I think we're not going to see a robust outcome in that area. The same with state-owned enterprises. I think that's going to be a very difficult issue as well. So once again, I think you'll see sufficient progress in these areas. for folks in the administration to point to and to say they've made inroads on these structural issues. But I think that critics of the administration and of this deal will find enough parts in this part of the agreement to show that the administration did not live up to its pronounced expectations in this area. And then with respect to enforcement, I think we will see agreement on lots of meetings between the two sides. We'll see language on the importance and China's commitment to live up to its obligations. And I think you'll see the United States reserving its right to impose unilateral measures against China. Another question will be, and I understand that the U.S. is pushing for China to agree not to counter-retaliate should the U.S. put in additional tariffs against China for not living up to its obligations. So up to now, every time the U.S. has imposed tariffs against China for its 301 violations, China has responded with its own tariffs. And what the United States is seeking is basically let us impose tariffs if you're not living up to your obligations, but you, China, please forgive your right to to impose counter retaliation with tariffs. That's going to be a very difficult issue for China to agree on.
Can I just follow up to something you said at the start of your answer, but do it with Arthur, that I think is, I'm not sure everybody knows or understands the extent to which on intellectual property, I mean, what you said would certainly not have been true not that long ago, that China now is enthusiastically moving towards, if that's how I take what you said, two stronger intellectual property regimens and protections and patents and the like. Can you explain, Arthur, put you on the spot a little, why that is, what's changed?
Well, I think the basic concept that economists such as myself have on this is that most countries steal intellectual property until they have some of their own to protect, and then suddenly they get interested in IP enforcement. That was certainly the case in the United States for much of the 19th century, and we've seen this also in other East Asian economies since World War II, that IP enforcement strengthened substantially after countries felt that it was in their interest to, their direct financial interest to do so. And China is beginning to get to the point where companies like Huawei, for example, have significant amounts of IP that do need to be protected. I do think it's going to be complicated because China is big and messy. A lot of the violations occur at the local level. The ability of the capacity of the central government to intervene effectively on these things is very spotty. The capacities of the IP courts in China have been increasing, but it's a massive, massive task. But I think the direction, the top level perspective in China is that, yeah, this is actually an area where they probably do want to get more serious. They want to promote more companies like Huawei that have their own IP to license. So it's in their interest to get some kind of a meeting of the minds with the U.S. on this.
Anybody else in the room? Yes, ma'am.
So, Arthur, you mentioned that Xi, by signing the deal, can solve domestic problem. Is this really the case? And how much China depends on the U.S., especially in the long run? I think that China has been already looking for alternative partners, and Trump has damaged the trust on which China-U.S. relation is based. Thanks.
Okay, so I'll separate that into sort of a cyclical macro management and then a structural element. So from a cyclical standpoint, China's economy has been weakening over the course of the last year. I think the numbers coming out of China in the first half of this year are going to be pretty bad by historical standards. Most of this is not related to the trade war. Most of this is related to domestic policy decisions, notably the campaign against financial leverage that has been ongoing for the last 2 years, which has really squeezed the shadow banking sector that was providing a lot of credit to real estate, to local governments, and to the private sector. So this credit squeeze has really had a pretty massive effect. They're now trying to reverse that. But I think part of what's going on is that the leaders know that the absolute worst period for them economically in the short run is the first half of this year. So it would be really beneficial to get a deal in place so that at least they don't have to worry about the tariffs, right? On the longer-term structural things, yeah, no question China would like to diversify its international relationships and reduce its reliance on the U.S. But the reality is, if, for example, in semiconductors, you really don't have much choice, right? There are a lot of things that are only available in the high-tech space from the U.S., and if you don't buy from the U.S., you have no alternative, right? I think that's very irksome to the Chinese leaders. That is what lies behind their desires, for example, to create a domestic semiconductor capacity. But the reality is that they just don't have the ability to free themselves from relationship with the U.S. right now. China is still dependent in general on foreign direct investment as a kind of a high-powered component of its growth. FDI inflows have gradually been coming down. They would like to keep those up. A certain percentage of that is going to have to come from the U.S., and I just don't think that there's any way to get around it. It's equally the case that I think the idea that you see sometimes in Washington, we can decouple the U.S. and Chinese economy at little or no cost to the U.S., I think those are just pure fantasy. U.S. companies rely on their presence in China for a whole host of reasons: revenue, access to talent, and access to a very rapid innovation and production cycle. If you're not operating in China and seeing what's going on, you're probably not prepared to compete fully in the global environment. So I think on both sides, what we're going to find is that this linkage between the Chinese and the U.S. economies is much stronger and much more resilient than the sort of nationalists on either side would like to acknowledge.
Wendy, I realize we've gone almost a whole hour and nobody's asked, so I'm going to ask about something that is maybe less substance, but that crazy moment which some of you may have seen in the Oval Office, I guess a week ago or so. If you didn't, in a nutshell, Bob Lighthizer, who, as we've been saying, is leading these negotiations for the United States, was in the Oval Office with his Chinese counterpart just to his left, and was talking about the process and some of the things we've been talking about, and an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, would be signed, and the president sort of interjected and said, I don't like MOUs, and really kind of called his own negotiator onto the carpet there and gave him a lesson or a talking to. And I'm just curious, Wendy, I get, in the scheme of things, I guess it doesn't matter that much, but how unusual was that? And if you were, because you've been in that position, and if you're sitting there and something like that happens, I mean, what did you make of it? And, anything you want to say about it?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. First, on substance, my view is, who cares what the agreement is called? You need to look at the commitments and how they're written. And so when I review whatever text is released after this deal is reached, and I expect it to be reached, I will look at the substance of the commitments. If it's called Memorandum of Understanding or Trade Agreement, frankly, I don't think that makes a difference. But on just that whole scene, that's kind of your nightmare as a negotiator. The minute your boss, whether for me it was the USTR or for the USTR, if it's the president, the minute your boss somehow calls into question your logic or your thinking or your positions, it's a very unfortunate moment, because it really serves to discredit you and makes your counterpart think, does this person really have the mandate? Can they really bring this deal home? In statements following this discussion in the Oval Office, which was, seen firsthand by Lee He, he was in the Oval Office with Ambassador Lighthizer at that time, but statements after went overboard in just, indicating how much faith the president has in Ambassador Lighthizer. And I do believe that's true. I think it was an unfortunate episode, but everything that I've heard and everything that I've seen, the president has full confidence in Ambassador Lighthizer. That doesn't mean he's going to agree to all the advice Ambassador Lighthizer gives him, because as Arthur mentioned earlier, the president will have competing pressures on him with respect to what this deal should look like. But I do think that there's really no one in the administration who could negotiate a 100-page plus document with China beyond Ambassador Lighthizer and his team at USTR. Now, I have some prejudice there. I've worked for USTR for 30 years, but I think many others in the administration would agree with me there.
Yeah, can I just throw in one more thing there? I think that episode underscores a perception on the Chinese side that there was no point that the deal would require a personal meeting between Xi and Trump, because you basically cannot trust anyone under Trump to be able to deliver a deal that Trump will, in fact, accept, right? So I think that's why this leaders' summit really becomes so crucial, not just on the U.S. side, but on the Chinese side, because I think the Chinese long ago concluded that unless Trump is personally there, publicly ratifying it, that there's anything up to that point is just not very useful.
All right. I think we need to wrap. But before we do, just a reminder that back at this hour, meaning 8:30 tomorrow morning, the Asia briefing will take up North Korea after the summit and where the roadmap for that issue goes next with Danny Russell and Carol Giacomo from the New York Times. I don't know, Arthur, if you can stick around and take some of the questions in the room, but Wendy Cutler, thank you so much for joining us. I don't believe, by the way, there's any more snow in the forecast, so we expect to see you all tomorrow morning. And Arthur, terrific presentation. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.